Hello, Professor Reilly.
Good to see you.
Can you hear me well?
Yes, I can hear you fine. Can you hear me?
Very well. So no echoes, no problems.
No, none on my end.
Okay. Thank you very much for being on my channel.
Of course, yeah. Glad to be here.
Would you like to introduce yourself the way you would like to do it?
Sure, I'm Wilfred Reilly. I'm an associate professor of political science at Kentucky State University down here in Frankfort, KY. And I'm the author of the books Hate, Crime, Hoax, Taboo, and most recently, Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me.
I noticed something in your biography which I didn't expect to see. You have a law degree.
Yes, I went to University of Illinois College of Law in 2005 and or from 2002 to 2005 and graduated, did fine. I was a bit young at the time. I'm sure I was pretty immature for a law student, but when I got out, I was I think 21 or 22. I grew up in the public schools in Chicago and Aurora, which are, try hard but aren't necessarily all that challenging. And I was promoted, socially promoted at least once. So when I graduated from high school, I was I think 17, and I got through college in 3.5 years. So when I was done with law school, I was 22, I suppose. And being a young lawyer is not extraordinarily exciting. I mean, this is before AI, and the U of I is not Ivy, but is good enough that you're going to
Sorry,
be working for
I'm
large
sorry.
firms.
I'm sorry. I didn't hear something very well. Being a young lawyer is not extraordinarily
Not extraordinarily exciting or fun.
exciting.
You
Thank you.
for
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, the majority of people that are young associates, as it's called in larger firms, which is where you're going if you come out of one of the Big Ten schools or one of the lower Ivies, like a larger law firm. Your job before AI would literally be looking through briefs and finding all the mistakes of spelling and law for 12 hours a day because you'd bill for every possible hour. And so looking at this and what my friends were doing, I decided there was some appeal to going back to school and, talking to girls and practicing my frisbee skills. So I applied to some graduate schools as I was applying to, firms and attorneys' offices and that kind of thing. And I got into Southern Illinois University, which is another large state university. These are all in the top 100, but not the top five. There are a lot of colleges in the USA. And they gave me a financial package. And so I went down there and then I ended up getting the PhD.
Okay, so you did practice law, I gather, for a while.
Well, no, generally as a law student, you're expected to intern, you're expected to apply for jobs and so on. I am not actually a currently practicing lawyer, and
Yes,
I
I'm
wouldn't
aware.
imagine. Yeah,
I'm
no,
aware
yeah,
of
but I
this.
like I did. Yeah, I didn't really practice law after college at all. Like I applied to the firms and the graduate schools, and I got into the graduate school. So I had the law degree. I'm probably taking the Kentucky bar this upcoming year, actually. I mean, there's no reason not to be a lawyer in your state. But no, I didn't have like 5 years of practice or something. I just saw, what that would entail. And, I preferred the academic option.
Oh, I see. I see. I'm so curious about this part of your bio because I have a law degree and I practice law for 17 years. And
Very
after
good.
this, I decided to come back to my uh, high school dreams, which was social sciences.
Hmm.
So uh, I'm curious about people who also faced this dilemma, law or social sciences. And I realized after many years of practicing law that it's not for me. Luckily for you, you realized this early on. You didn't waste
Very early.
17 years practicing it.
Well, I mean, yeah, from a little background, I'm sure you're good and you get paid. So there are the term that we used in the States at the time, which I'm pretty sure is global, was golden handcuffs. Like you're obviously not
No, it's
oppressed
not
or
global. I haven't heard it.
really. Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, golden handcuffs is just the idea that you can be a fairly wealthy person in a job you really dislike, but that you can't really leave. And this is a common practice among young lawyers or people who were in their residency as surgeons and so on when I was finishing up my 3L year. And again, there's nothing to gripe about. They're worse lives than, driving your Porsche down Michigan Avenue to go to work. But, you'll make it, But it's the idea of you get a certain house at a certain place and your wife, and there are going to be some expectations there, two vehicles. Like, you're not going anywhere. So I was able to, before that happened, I guess, look at the prospect and say, well, college professors from a working class standpoint, especially writing as much as I do, aren't, terribly poor either. And it seems like much more fun. You get to help kids, in a smaller school, you might do some coaching or something like that. So that was the route I went.
I see. Okay, let's move to your books. So to begin with, where can one obtain them?
Well, you get Amazon. I mean, these are all one of the things that I would say made me fairly well known as a public intellectual. I still do academic work. I was one of the co-authors on the recent Corey Clark paper on academic censorship, all that. But my popular press books, one of them came out with Regnery, which is the country's largest conservative press. Actually, so did the next. That's Hate, Crime, Hoax, and Taboo. I have one academic monograph published as well, very small scale. But the this one came out with HarperCollins. Broadside is an imprint of HarperCollins, so the book is available Amazon.com, Goodreads. We recently had a meeting, got it into Walmart. So there are, I mean, it's pretty findable. Target.com, yeah, and hopefully
Usual
people
places. I
will
get it.
go out and pursue that.
I get it. Usual places. Thank
Mhm.
you. In Lies, my liberal teacher told me, you write about the Red Scare. The Red Scare actually was not some baseless fear. And this caught my attention because right now there are new works coming, unfortunately, in Russian. So they're not available to the Western public yet. That very nicely tie to what you have written. These books demonstrate that the Soviet Union was serious about, under Stalin, was serious about starting World War III, was actively preparing. It was a matter of a few years before the Soviet Union would start the war. And this indicates that this infiltration in the United States had been parts of the preparations.
Yes.
Would you like to elaborate on the Red Scare?
Yes. So one of my that's a great question. I mean, you added some detail there that I think a lot of people probably don't know. I mean, there were Russian war
If
plans
if
just
if
as there were.
if I may interrupt you and mention one of the sources, for example, Kleistud Zakoretsky wrote Stalin's World War III, and now there is another Russian author, Alexander Gugun, who is giving lectures on the subject and who is preparing a book on the subject. So there is mounting evidence that Stalin was really preparing to take over the world. It was not a baseless conspiracy theory. There is mounting evidence, like I said. So please go
Yes,
on.
that's correct. I mean, so in the chapter of the book dealing with the Red Scare, I mean, I make the point that in the West and sort of the upper middle class, we've almost been trained to view this as a pointless panic. I mean, there was a movie that came out a couple of years ago called Trumbo, where the hero was a communist. He was a brave Hollywood man who was just being harassed for who he was and his socialist beliefs. And this is very standard. We use the term McCarthyism to describe Biden and Trump supporters
Yes,
harassing
exactly.
one another. But in reality, I mean, Joe McCarthy himself was an alcoholic, he had some problems as a man. But the overall idea that there were a large number of Russian saboteurs in the USA and that they were funding branches of the peace movement, the anti-nuclear movement, this is something that we now know to be true. And as you've mentioned, we've also read the Russian war plans, and to be fair, the American war plans for a potential global conflict that often is referred to as World War III. That's not something that was made up
Yes,
either.
but there is one big but. The
Uh-huh.
Americans never thought of putting these plans in motion, while Stalin was actually preparing to start World War III. He postponed it on several occasions, as it turns out. Zakoretsky covers this in Stalin's World War III, mostly because, hello?
Oh yes, I'm still here. I'm just the video will be dark for a second.
Okay. I thought that the connection is.
No, yeah. There's one technical problem. But
So
I am still
the
here.
thing is that United States never actually intended they were never preparing to start, say, in a year or so, while the Soviet Union was several times close to starting it and was postponing it because there were new weapon developments in United States. So first Stalin needed the bomb. After Stalin got the bomb, it turns out the Americans had moved on with means to delivering the bomb. So he needed a new long-range bomber. So he was postponing and postponing, and luckily, eventually, he died and probably was murdered by his associates. So this is why the Soviet Union never launched these plans. As far as I know, United States never planned to launch these plans. They were just contingency plans. So it's
No, I
not the
think
same
it's
thing.
correct. Yeah, and I mean, so I love America, but I mean, if the Russians were 4 or 5 times as warlike as we were, that's saying something, and that's a reality. I mean, Stalin obviously was one of history's great evil dictators. This gets into a sideline in the book, by the way, which is the fact that in the United States, in modern, not just academic, but kind of media parlance, we don't talk a lot about communism. There aren't really any movies about, say, Castro's takeover of Cuba, painting him correctly as a villain. The one film about Che Guevara is called The Motorcycle Diaries, and it's kind of an inspiring student travel
Yes,
piece.
yes, and
There's not,
Che Guevara was a mass murderer.
yeah, Che Guevara was a cruel fanatic. Yes, he hated blacks, he hated homosexuals. He didn't like a range of people, including, as I recall, Eastern Europeans. He was a nutcase, and that's the
Che Guevara, excuse me for interrupting you. Che
yeah,
Guevara, by the way, in his own memoirs, mentions how he personally used to kill people,
yes. And I
shooting
mean,
them
no,
in
I
the
will
head.
say most of my favorite rappers do that too. But yeah, the idea that wearing Che Guevara on a shirt as a college woman would be equivalent to Goebbels or something like that. Not quite
Yes,
Hitler
yes,
or
I
Stalin.
fully agree
But
with you.
yeah. Well, yeah, it's one of history's just negative figures. But the whole thing with all of this though is that we don't spend a lot of time talking about the defining event of the 20th century in the modern West, and that is the fall of the other social system that competed with us for dominance of the world, Marxist Leninist communism. And that is remarkable. Like the Berlin Wall has been almost forgotten as a symbol, chopped one of the world's great cities in half for half a century. So in the book, I talk about this and I say, like, a lot of what we're saying, I have some of your points, some of my points, but also just like as a political scientist, I've been expected to and did look at the Venona cables, as they're called. We declassified many of, when we were friendly enough with the Russians following the collapse of the Soviet Union, most of the communiques between Russia and her agents in the USA and the UK were declassified. So we know, simplifying this, but who many or most of the Russian spies were. And when I read through these, I was not surprised, but amused maybe to realize that almost every liberal cause celeb, like Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, Mr. Trumbo himself, go back to Whittaker Chambers, Witness, Alger Hiss, all of these people were actually Russian spies. They're named in the cables. You can find them on Britannica or Wikipedia. They had handlers. So I make this point. This wasn't just some frenzy. There actually was an enemy there.
By the way, most of this was on the surface all the time. I remember from my childhood how the Rosenbergs were portrayed as martyrs in the People's Republic of Bulgaria. So
Mhm.
the communist authorities were openly presenting them as our people.
Yes.
So we much of the information is on the surface, and we don't need certain documents to be declassified. Not to mention that documentation in the Soviet Union didn't work like the documentation in the West. But I don't want to stray from your book. By the way, there are some positive developments. Yes, unfortunately, the Westerners don't realize how horrible socialism was. I call it socialism because I grew under it. Uh, but recently, there is a positive development. The European Parliament, of all institutions, issued a resolution where they in black and white, state that the Soviet Union was no less to blame for the outbreak of World War II than Nazi Germany.
Good. Yeah.
And again, the information has been on the surface all the time because the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact has been published for so many decades. So it's not really new information, but it's new. It's surprisingly new for the people on the street. I've done this experiment again and again, talking to lay people in the West. I live in the West now. And most of them have no clue. When I, for example, tell them about this resolution, they look at me as though I'm talking gibberish, as though I'm some conspiracy theorist who is telling them that the earth is flat or something. Yet it has been known. Stalin was no less, Stalin wanted World War II, and now it turns out Stalin wanted prepared for World War III, and Stalin was preparing to initiate World War III.
Yes,
So the Red Scare was really scary.
Yes, the Reds were very scary. Yeah. No, I think that you're pointing out something that's actually fairly deep and that's still going on in the West, which is the desire of sort of a rebellious, mostly leftist minority in the West to resist the society that we have. I'm sure this exists in all societies, but because the West is currently the world's leading society, in practice, they generally do this by sort of reifying dictators and lunatics and terrorists. And this, we've seen this actually at one point, we've seen this in every recent conflict. I mean, there's a chapter in the book about hippies, and I actually watched some videos of the student protests, and I expected, flowers and women burning their bras and this sort of thing. But I mean, they were chanting. It was these young fighting men. You remember how many riots there were when you see them chanting like "Ho Ho Ho Chi Minh," waving Vietnamese flags and North Vietnamese flags and so on down the line. And you see this today with the Israeli-Palestine conflict. I mean, I'm sure mistakes on all sides and all that, but people are waving actual Hamas flags. Yeah, the graffiti that was written on the marble facing of Union Station in D.C. was "Hamas is coming for you" or something like that. Hamas is coming. So it's, if you are resisting the conservative party in the West, that's not the same thing as resisting the Chinese communists. Like, the people you're going to have to invoke as the other enemies of the conservative party in the West are almost always bad. So that's something that's just very obvious, but that's rarely said.
Speaking of mentioning the hippies, Jane Fonda at the time went to the Vietnamese and proclaimed that socialism, or maybe she called it communism. I don't care what she did. She was an ignorant, stupid woman. But she proclaimed that socialism is the future, something along those lines, that it's the best thing for humanity. I don't remember her exact words, but that is disgusting. I mean, imagine somebody, a great Hollywood actor, a famous Hollywood actor, going to Nazi Germany and proclaiming that Nazism, National Socialism, actually, that's the real name. Let's not forget this. National Socialism is the bright future of the world. This actor now would be totally despised. But nobody despises Jane Fonda. Actually, nobody even remembers what she said, and she's just one of many examples. Charlie Chaplin, for example, was another who proclaimed that he went even further, not only praising Stalinism, but he went even further, saying that all these public trials in the Soviet Union, they were actually trying people who were guilty and so on. If you begin to compile the list of these Western intellectuals, it's a very long list. It's endless. It goes on and on. Bernard Shaw, and Bernard Shaw, the only person who got an Oscar and a Nobel Prize. So you cannot get any more famous than that. He loved socialism. He, by the way, also loved National Socialism, because they were also killing a lot of people, and he was into mass murder. But he was even mocking the victims of the man-made famine in Ukraine, where in 1933 the Soviet Union exterminated something like 7 million Ukrainians, and he was making fun of them. He said, when he was asked by journalists about the famine in Soviet Union, he said, "What famine? I had a very good meal in Moscow. I ate very well." This sort of thing.
Yes, I mean that's an ongoing. Yeah, this is an ongoing problem for the West, basically. I mean, sort of the internal fifth column celebrating every enemy. And again, I don't want to compare the scale of these things. And by the way, it went beyond the figures that you're talking about, as you know. I mean, serious newsmen, Walter Durante is the classic example,
Yes,
would
yes.
go to the Soviet Union and they'd be
He
led on these
got Pulitzer.
obvious propaganda tours. I'm sorry.
He got Pulitzer.
Yes, yeah, he got a Pulitzer Prize, and he went to the Soviet Union. And again, it's the same sort of thing, denied that major famines were going on. What would generally happen, of course, is that these people would be taken on these obvious propaganda tours where they'd go through literal Potemkin villages and they'd be told about what did he call it? The system that works, the future is here. And then they would come back and they would engage in this hagiography. And the reasons for this, I'm a political scientist, not a psychologist, but are interesting to explore. I mean, hostility toward one's own society. I mean, the artist is a bourgeois who feels guilty, right? Like these are disaffected children of the upper middle class. Whereas, I mean, I, by background, it was a normal working class kid. I happened to be intelligent and got fairly successful. But I mean, I've been able to evaluate different steps along the American ladder. And of course, it's not perfectly fair, but it's pretty much what you'd expect a functional society to be. And the people that I've found that hate this model almost always tend to be from one specific background. The group most likely to vote for the Democrats and the Greens in the USA at about 78% is upper middle class college educated white women. And I think at a certain level that doesn't surprise anyone. You've been to a dinner party, you know that. But yeah, this type of shit, when it goes on for decades and when our opponents are the people that they are, becomes very negative and very dangerous. And you're absolutely right. Like communists have not been treated like the Hitlerites were. I mean, imagine someone saying they are a Nazi. You go on a date with someone and it's subtle, but they have iron crosses on their keychain or a shirt with Hitler on it. No, not Hitler. We said Goebbels. Someone that not everyone would immediately recognize, but it wouldn't last very long. That's exactly where we are with communism right now, where you see perhaps not Lenin, but Marx or Che on, college girls' streetwear, and the little red book is for sale in every bookstore I've been to this year, and so on. It's a weird failure to recognize what our existential opponent was for a long time. I don't really know how much more to say about that, but it's something I talk about in the book. It's something you've talked about. And it's a real problem because what you don't recognize as non-functional or even evil can happen easily again.
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
I'm
I mean, like there's a
seeing the.
communist party in most European countries. There's no Nazi party. There's no Ku Klux Klan running for office in southern U.S. states because we've stigmatized those things fairly well.
I've had conversations with local people here in the United Kingdom, where I live, and for them, socialism is about free healthcare or something. And when I begin to talk about mass graves and stuff like this, they're just puzzled. I mean, they don't see the connection. And yet the experiment has been done and the evidence is there. And by the way, you mentioning the Iron Crosses, the last time I went to vote here on the ballot, there was a party which symbol was a hammer and sickle.
Yeah.
So imagine a party with a swastika there. It would
Well,
be outrageous, but the hammer and sickle somehow is normal.
yeah, and I think we're both saying the same thing. Like, yes, communism. So there's another level here. Honestly, so point one that was made here, we understand now from both the experiences of people who've come here from Eastern Europe and Venezuela and so on, and I would say the declassification of these major documents, we understand that the Red Scare was based on something that was very real, and we understand something of what socialism was. Step two, I think, is that a lot of people haven't reached that understanding. So there's still a distinction between how we treat communists and how we treat Nazis or Klansmen or Confederates or black nationalists, advocates of any other crazy ideology that's been expressed over the years. Um, and I think point three is that one of the reasons for this is that in the West, a lot of our academics and journalists actually are communists. That sounds like an exaggeration from center right podcaster on the stream, But I mean, there's an article on the Econ Live, just perfectly mainstream data resource called "The Prevalence of Marxism in Academia," where they did a good anonymous, I think it was a list experiment, and they asked people to place themselves in certain categories on the political spectrum. And I don't know if this is a list or not actually, but it's pretty well done in terms of data collection. Anyway, right now, 18% of American social scientists say they're Marxists. Another 21% say they're activists, and another 24%, this was done, so these are all different categories, say they're radicals. So you have an enormous, this, by the way, is the simple answer to how can people in the sciences believe this bullshit? Like, Gad Saad famously asked people the question, do you think some women have 9-inch penises? How do you get people to think this? Well, these are the teachers. History isn't just written by the victors, it's written by the history professors. So having this is a major issue. Like the people writing about Marx are often Marxists, whereas the people writing about Hitler, for all their flaws, for everything you can say about warmongering American or European culture, whatever, they're not Nazis. Like they might not have every fact of every battle correct, but there's no sympathy for the mustachioed German. There certainly is for every major communist, and it shows.
Well, this brings me to the next question on my list, which is why the facts don't matter, because you've made the case about the Red Scare, like about so many other things. We will simply not have time to cover everything, obviously. And yet, people believe what they want to believe. Can facts and evidence change anything then?
I think that this is actually a really important question. I mean, I consider myself to be a more than competent intellectual, but I've struggled with some aspects of this myself because when you see what seem to be thousands of people saying something that is absolutely crazy, I mentioned the 9-inch penis. I mean, this was a scientifically phrased question. Some women have 9-inch penis. I'm not just going to keep saying this to be funny, but when you see like the American Psychological Association or the American Medical Association saying this, one level of analysis that goes on in your brain, if you're a fair correspondent, is, am I crazy? Am I missing something? And I think the answer has to be no. I mean, obviously, there's a facility of logic that makes it possible for me to serve on a jury, that makes it possible for me to edit for an interdisciplinary journal, which I do, JOIPS as it's called, that makes it possible for me to write an op-ed to a major newspaper. There's a general communicative faculty of logic among humans, right? So the question then becomes, why are so many people saying things that are objectively crazy? And I think that we just touched on the answer. The people that are supposed to produce neutral scientific information have been corrupted in some weird way. It's extremely bizarre that 18% of them are communists. Now, I actually pulled up national data to compare, and 1/3 of 1% of all Americans are Marxists or Leninists, socialists, whatnot. So I mean, 40,000% overrepresentation in these specific fields. And I think that causes people outside that block to sort of shut their mouths very often. I mean, everyone needs to get along. People are working in one departmental hallway. It results in people who do have these activist beliefs seeking out positions where they can advance them. So, I mean, these positions on transgenderism, for example, tend to come from one small panel at one mid-sized conference, that sort of thing. If you polled all doctors in the country, went to Kentucky, you wouldn't get these results. But I mean, so the question is, can facts overcome what, even though it results from bias and slant among a relatively few people, seems like an overwhelming majority position? I think so. I think most people recognize what reality is. So when you look at kind of the center right or quote unquote the red pill movement in the non-abusive sense, and you see what people are saying, there are a lot of references to, for example, the emperor's new clothes, to the idea that obviously for reasons of social perseverance in reality, a lot of people can do nutty things at once, but it's still very possible to point out reality and change the opinion of a lot of people at once, or the expressed opinion of a lot of people at once. That became kind of rambly, but like a very simple way of putting this, I actually asked the penises question once on Twitter. So like I asked a series of, no, but like I have a pretty, we'd say bro in America, but like male, 25 to 45 fan base. But my Twitter account, which has about 100,000 followers, also includes, the feminist girlfriends of all of these people, people's wives. And so I asked a series of these questions. Like one was, do you believe that your upper middle class Black and Asian friends are oppressed? One of them actually was, do you believe some women have, blank inch penises? And I expected the result to be, say, 70-30, no, they don't. I already knew that in a fully anonymous environment, this was in a non-Twitter poll linked to a SurveyMonkey link. I already knew that most people would say, no, I don't believe this. But yeah, I expected a sizable chunk of people to actually believe it. The actual results, as I recall, were 98-2, no. So in reality, given that double layer of anonymity, nobody thinks this is true. And I don't just want to keep yapping about this, but I think that's pretty important. Like, can the facts matter? Yes. Like when a study comes out that finds that, for example, in that gender space, quote unquote transition is terrible. Like most people regret it after a couple of years. It doesn't decrease suicide. There's going to be a massive body of people who say, well, that doesn't surprise me at all. What you're doing is taking mentally ill people and cutting off their genitals. That sounds nuts. I mean, so yes, that facts like that can have a significant impact. We're just working uphill.
I see. By the way, we are running out of time, so we need to make a second video because we will be cut off any time. If you like,
I'd be fine doing one more video.
Sorry.
No, I'd be fine doing one more video. Yeah.
Okay. So we have to cut off here somewhere and then reconnect.
We just talk until the end of this, right? And then you can send me another link.
Okay, but it will be an abrupt interruption. I mean, it will be just in the middle of nowhere.
With a minute left, we can both drop.
Okay.
I can see it up here on the right-hand corner of the screen.
I'm increasingly thinking whether there is something deeper than that, because it's not just politics, it's not just about left, conservative, and so on. I've seen this as a lawyer in the courtrooms, how the evidence doesn't matter. And the evidence very often doesn't matter when you are asking something that the judge to make a ruling that hasn't been done before, to find something that hasn't been found before, or you're presenting evidence that is untypical, and people are scary, wary of going where nobody has been before, and they would find all sorts of excuses to ignore the evidence. I mean, judges are actually very good at this. They could rule the evidence as you know, inadmissible, and even if it's admissible, they could simply not address this evidence, or if they address it, they could misinterpret it. They have many ways, procedural ways, actually, to get around evidence they don't want to deal with, or claims they don't want to deal with. And I was thinking whether this is not something intrinsic to humans throughout history, because take, for example, Kuhn and his structure of the scientific revolution. He was writing decades ago that science actually is that most scientists are actually an impediment to moving of science. That they're very skillful. Are we having an echo?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. That science is actually very good at ignoring evidence that doesn't fit with the dominant wisdom in their field, until eventually the problems become so many, the evidence mounts so much after decades that they could no longer ignore it. And I can see this also in politics. I can see this in every area, and I'm beginning to think: is it something deeper, that people simply don't care about the evidence? Is it that people are not logical creatures? They want to stick to their beliefs, or to stick to whatever it makes them socially acceptable.
Yes.
Could it be the deeper reason that it's not just a political thing?
To jump in there, I mean, yes, I think that's correct. So I'm not an economist, but economists talk about this a lot, actually, that the market is never going to be perfectly rational. because there are different things that drive people. Like there's bias toward the known, which is what you're describing. There's ignorance. Not everyone's aware of the qualities of different products. There's morality, which I think is fascinating. People won't do the logical because big juju told them not to. And there's manipulation, like people will simply lie to you in the field of sales and so on. So there's bias, ignorance, morality, and manipulation that limit the efficacy of the logical choices you can make. And I mean, in this case, I think that none of what you said really contradicts my core point to heterodox intellectuals, including yourself, which is remember that logic is real. If you are a person who's a lawyer, a social sciences academic, something like that, you've spent your entire life training your logical facilities in the same way that you would practice your jump shot or your goaltending in soccer or something like that. You're not suddenly wrong. You're not suddenly missing obvious things like women are the people that are not men, to use the example that we've been using. So the question becomes, why are people rejecting something that's obviously true? If a competent attorney comes to court with a ream of evidence that's a little atypical, but that could set a new precedent, and the judge just says inadmissible, why is the judge doing that? And I think the short answer is that it falls into the bias that we've described. That one would be bias toward the known. There are a whole. I actually wrote down some of the economic biases. Prejudice toward the known is the classic one, sometimes called rejection of novelty. But there's avoidance of risk. Like, what's the potential risk and the potential reward of this decision? Well, the reward of accepting the known and publishing is moderate social status, but the risk is nothing. What's the reward of proposing a radical new theory for the first time? Well, it potentially, I mean, you could massively accelerate your career, you could help the world, but what's the risk? Well, you could be destroyed. I mean, an entire field could turn against you. People could label you an idiot and a Bigfoot hunter. So there tends to be a bias toward moderate risk and moderate reward. Like I tend to think cryptozoologists are right about some stuff, man. We don't know what's going on down there in the ocean. And this again, wildly out of field. This is just me talking. But I mean, I would suspect that some of that stuff, like we've seen squid the size of battleships and so on, that's very likely accurate. But we don't know. So when you start saying things like that, very high risk to moderate reward. So that's another bias. Desire for social desirability. I think that this is the big one with leftists. I think on the right, we have a lot more people that are more male coded, a little more hostile in the good sense, awkward to get along with, soldiers and attorneys and that kind of thing. But I think on the left, I mean, it's more heavily female, more heavily middle class. There's a real desire not to stir things up. I hear people say that a lot when they speak on some of my writings. Um, Troublemaker was the term used for black and white civil rights activists in the States in the 60s. So if you say something like, well, of course, racism causes all problems in black communities, you're being very socially acceptable at this moment, which is why it often takes awkward, unpleasant, prickly sort of people to drive science forward. I don't think either Arthur Jensen, the famous hereditarian geneticist, or James Flynn, his opponent and friend who found that IQs are rising, I don't know how nice either of them would be over tea. They strike me as these very smart men of science that could rip you apart in a debate. But it's those types that generally move things forward. And a lot of people don't want to be one of those types. I think it really is that simple.
I see. Well, that's please excuse me because I strayed the conversation away from the subject matter of
Oh,
your.
that's fine.
Uh, I would like to ask you, what would you like to say without me asking? If you care to, if you have some favorite thing you would like to say or favorite subject, because I'm sure that whatever I think of is not necessarily what is. I mean, today I was thinking of Cato the Elder, who famously used to say cartridge must be destroyed in each of his speeches. So, do you have some favorite pet subject like Cato the Elder?
Well, I mean, so first of all, I didn't know he said that in every speech. I mean, imagine how annoying that would be if you're in the anti-war faction. Every section of every Roman speech closes with that. But I think because it looks like we're gonna run to the end of one of these Zoom panels and we're gonna start another one. I mean, I think in one sentence, just a friend of mine once said, "A thing is what it is. It's not something else." A great deal of modern, especially left-wing social science consists of using insane jargon to describe normal life. Objectification is looking at men or women or whatever. And I would encourage people just to remember that you have this ability to engage in logic.
Well,
I mean, so my piece of advice for people, we're talking about something that I think is a real issue, which is the the sort of the prevalence of nonsense in the mainstream. So we've mentioned the refusal to honestly discuss communism or socialism. We've mentioned the transgender issue. We've mentioned some of the racial stuff. And I think that a lot of people have a reflective reaction when they see this sort of thing being propounded by the American Medical Association or something like that of, well, all of those people, all those docs can't be wrong. I must be wrong. I must be crazy. And what I think we both said is, well, no, you're probably not. There are all of these biases that operate within organizations that people write about in org theory that predict this kind of thing. I mean, has the institution been kind of captured by, radicals of one color or another? I mean, in the sense of flags, not people. Is there a really intense social desirability bias where everyone just sort of goes along? That to me, I think, is the case with the claim that racism causes all problems in Black communities. I mean, that's clearly not true. The same problems were much less serious in even the 1930s and 40s when there was violent racial conflict fairly frequently. If you're talking about fatherlessness and people being out of work and so on, the same problems that exist for poor whites today at the same level. I live in Appalachia. The higher level, if you're talking about something like opiate use, sales, and death, the same problems do not exist for immigrants, quote unquote, of color, West Africans, Asians. So South Asians in the USA have none of these problems. Nigerians and Indians are the two best educated groups. So the claim is just false, but it feels very rude to say that. Just like it feels rude for some people to say, well, men and women are obviously different. Why are women more often in childcare roles? Well, because women are two-thirds the size of men, slightly smarter verbally. An eighth is aggressive. If you look at testosterone levels, they're more likely to like children. They're better with children. It feels a bit bizarre to say that. So the default is sort of, oh, sexism. It's a tough question. I don't know. So basically, my point was just that people should recognize that they have the ability to utilize logic. Almost anyone listening to this show with the two of us talking is going to be pretty skilled at that task. And you should recognize, I think the line I used was that a thing is what it is, it's not something else. This actually came up in a conversation where one of my friends was asking if he was a pimp. This was years ago. He was doing something or the other with OnlyFans, and we were all sitting in a bar, very pubbish. This is in like an Irish neighborhood in Chicago. And he asked, I'm doing this, this, and this. I'm technically a managerial director. Am I a pimp? I'm never going to name this guy. But someone just looked at him kind of disgustedly. I was like a Mexican guy and a Polish guy. And like a couple people at the same time were like, something is what it is. It's not anything else. And that I'd read the line before in a much more academic setting, but that kind of stuck with me. And I think at this moment, when you're seeing some crazy things on the left and even some crazy things on the far right, if you see people in business suits saying what sounds like lunatic bullshit, just accept that it probably is. You're probably, if you're a country lawyer or something, you haven't had this facility that allows you to think logically your entire life that's now gone. I guess that's basically the point. Continue to use logic, continue to think rationally to the extent you can. Realize it's not you. Like sometimes everyone really is wrong, especially if, when you think about the trans polling example I used, none of them are really saying what they think. They're all saying what they've been told to say. And by the way, this is kind of a sequence back to the first thing we talked about, last sentence from me. But I get the feeling that this was very intense under socialism, and maybe you can clarify that. But there were
yeah,
things everyone had to say
I
that
was
no one
thinking,
believed.
I was thinking exactly about socialism while I was listening to what you just said. Uh, I was thinking that for a lie to thrive, you don't need to actually to convince people that it's true. Because
Yes.
back in the late 70s and in the 80s, when I was around in the People's Republic of Bulgaria, I
Mhm.
knew already that people did not take the communist bullshit seriously. That nobody believes. Maybe some people in the West believed, but nobody believed in under socialism. It turned out after this that even the people who were top-notch communists, they also didn't believe it. Nobody believed it. Yet everybody repeated it. In public places. Obviously,
Yeah.
between ourselves, if we trust one another, if we are between relatives and or close friends, we would say what we think. But publicly, everybody repeated the lie, although nobody was fooled by it. And this brings me to the present day. The fact that people can think logically and doesn't necessarily mean that the lie will not work. The lie still
Yes.
works. As long as it is enforced by the social convention, by the cancel culture, by so many other things, it will work. So
Yes.
this is actually a somber point. I don't know whether this is the right word. English is obviously not my
No,
mother.
it's correct.
Which means that it could last for a long time. When socialism lasted for 70 years, and in some countries it's still going on. It's not over.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point, but just briefly, it's a point with two parts. So I actually wrote down your line. For a lie to thrive, you don't have to convince people it's true. And that's a point with depth that we sometimes forget. But I think the flip side of that is with the sort of lies we're talking about, they can thrive without anyone believing them. So there's an extreme vulnerability on the part of the strategic player that's stuck defending this lie. Like I'm sure you'll correct me, you know much more about this than I do, but my impression was that when you got into sort of the glasnost and perestroika era at the end of communism, things fell remarkably rapidly. They collapsed far more rapidly than the Russian strategists, and Russians are chess players, had ever expected them to. And my theory about this would be that this gets into no one believing this stuff. I mean, the assumption was that, even if we give people the chance to vote, for example, or speak a bit more, there are many loyal regime men, was a term Brezhnev once used. There are many people that really support us. Communism might win in a democratic process. That turned out not to be true. Nobody wanted to wear Russian blue jeans. I mean, like when people were given the option of choosing the capitalists to interface with the West, with the East, with the rest of the world, it seems to me that almost everyone chose that very rapidly. Like the Berlin Wall was beaten down from the East. So this is the same thing with this stuff. Like people can be convinced to say George Floyd is one of the most magnificent human beings ever to have existed. In an upcoming movie, the host, kind of Sacha Baron Cohen style, gets people to sign a petition to change the name of the Washington Monument to the George Floyd Monument. So from George Washington to George Floyd. But nobody believes this shit. Like if you turn the camera off, no one's gonna do it. Even this guy, Matt Walsh, the conservative commentator, I don't see why I would name him. But as I recall, even he found out that 2/3 of his signatures were fake. It's you can make people say stupid stuff, but you can't make them think it most of the time. Not for a while.
But they don't need to think it. That was my point.
Sure.
It works even if nobody believes it. It still works. Like it worked under socialism. Nobody believed it yet it worked. And I don't think that the socialist experience, you very aptly reminded us that it collapsed remarkably quickly. We were surprised by how quickly it's collapsed. I never imagined that it will be that quickly. But looking back, we can see that that was not because there were no believers, because there were no believers under Stalin as well. Yet socialism under Stalin was very much alive and kicking. It was in no danger of collapsing. So why it collapsed so quickly? It collapsed so quickly because it was enforced by a machine, the totalitarian machine. And the totalitarian machine is like any machine. It's not like a living organism. It cannot limp on. There are certain components. When you remove even one cog, everything else stops working like a clock, like a mechanical clock. You don't need to break all its parts for it to stop. You just need to remove just one cog. That's enough. And Gorbachev removed several at the time. So I don't think that this gives us any hope that all of a sudden this lie will disappear quickly. It may linger on and it may get worse and worse. I have no idea what will happen, but I don't think that the Soviet experience proves anything here.
Yeah, well, I think
Because,
it doesn't.
excuse me, it is in the Soviet Union, it was contingent on the totalitarian state. Here, it is not contingent on the totalitarian state. Here, it is contingent on a large part of the population that wants these things to be said, wants these things to be repeated. And these
Yeah,
people cannot disappear overnight. I mean, a totalitarian state can disintegrate very quickly, but half of the population, or even if it's smaller part of half, I don't know the exact percentage, they will not go anywhere.
well, I think that there's the point that we're talking about here. I would summarize as a big lie can survive without believers, but not without defenders.
Ah,
And I don't think that this just I don't even know if communism is the ultimate example here. I would say that religion is the ultimate example here. And I'm not like a brutal atheist that's never been seen at a church and hates the different faiths. But I mean, when you look at the extreme of very doctrinaire pre-Reformation Catholicism in the Middle Ages, where you really had the full list of sins that were being treated as mortal, which means punishable by death, and venial, and you had the Inquisition, so on down the line, people were selling indulgences and so on. I would suspect that the vast majority of people, at least post printing, at least who'd seen a Bible, didn't take this very seriously. They didn't believe everything they were told. Most people probably didn't believe that a pope who came from the Borgia family was an especially moral man. You know, people were in the same clan were having themselves painted as the image of Jesus and so on. I don't think people necessarily thought that this was real. It was simply that to challenge the system was very, very dangerous. You might be burned alive. And there are many examples throughout history. Do recruits into the American or the Russian military believe everything that they're being told and so on? There are a good number of examples of situations where everyone says something that most people don't believe. And I think what keeps this going is the same sort of thing, which is that there is a group of defenders of the system that will try to punish you if you violate the system. So, I mean, under communism, obviously, there was a dictatorial or sometimes totalitarian government that would enact pretty serious penalties if, for example, you attempted to print an opposition newspaper. In the USA, it's a little more vague, but it's not the 50% of the population that in fact believes these ideas. I mean, I
well,
think that
I
the
don't
idea
know
is
the percentage. I
yeah,
said 50 because of the election results, because they're
of course. No,
usually
but I think that
50-50.
yeah, my guess would be that it's about 3% of the population, like Mao's 3%, that really believes this stuff, one, and that two, is willing to punish other Americans, something that for all our issues, we've always had a strong taboo against for speech. So it's this one group of people, and we've almost built a commissar class in the USA. I don't know if as a British citizen from another country you've noticed this, but I mean, our issue when we talk about wokeness in the States, that's not just like the Republicans, quote unquote, working the referees by complaining about the Democrats. There's a lot of this is the result of law that we have, like court cases interpreting our Civil Rights Act, that have resulted in this entire structure of in most corporations, you have departments of DEI, diversity, HR and new HR, quote unquote,
Oh,
that are
it's exactly the same over here. I mean, it may differ in details, but the basics are the same. The
well,
fundamentals are the same over here in UK.
I think that what in practice, if you're opposing this as I am, and I mean, some of my friends oppose this professionally. I don't think they'd mind that description. Chris Rufo, James Lindsay. I mean, they're essentially consultants from the center right on how to get rid of this stuff. Um, I think that to defeat wokeness in America, which I would describe as kind of the idea that all of society is structured to oppress whatever the group is, blacks or women. Um, any disparities in performance indicate this oppression. And this is the important part. The solution is equity, which is proportional representation across every field, regardless of qualifications. To defeat this idea, what you'd really have to do is get rid of or neuter the people that are the defenders of this idea, which I would define as the people that are in the different diversity and so on bureaucracies, and also the people in academia that are promoting these ideas and making them public. And there's a whole cast of actors that exists around this. We have massive civil rights groups in the states that take in $500 million a year. Civil rights groups, quote unquote. I mean, our major races haven't been killing each other for decades now, but you've got basically, without just going on and on, you have a structure here. And if you want to defeat these ideas by instituting a new set of norms where people don't have to express them, that's where you'd be targeted. You'd want to get rid of those people. And you're starting to see some states do that. I mean, Florida's basically done this. They've said that in state institutions, there are a whole bunch of things, DEI, CRT, critical theory, ESG, SEL. I don't know how familiar you are with American business language, but that you really can't promote. You can't have a Department of X. And I can't imagine that not improving the speech climate.
Do you work on any future books? Do you have any new projects? Would you like to
Yeah,
share
well,
something about that?
sure. Yeah. I mean, well, I'm a college professor, so you're expected to write a book a year or you'll get fired, generally at a state institution. I mean, I'm not sure how thrilled they are with all of my books, but I mean, they're all good sellers, and they're not. I think a notable thing about my writing is that I'm actually pretty obviously not a bigot in any particular direction. I mean, the End of Hate Crime hoax talks about hoaxes from the alt-right, the far right of the political spectrum. I talk about discrimination against whites, but also discrimination against blacks. So I mean, in reality, they've been quite good about them, and I mean, yeah, I expect I'll keep publishing. So right now, I don't have another book that's fully sketched out. I've thought about writing a book called Alt Wrongs, and in fact, drawn up a full prompt for that and so on, which is looking at kind of the extreme right in the West. I've also drawn up about the equivalent for a book on Black identity extremists. There are a large number of Black radicals who seem to believe that everything in the world was invented by Black people. And I thought
Yes,
this movement was
I've seen
sort
some
of a
of those.
joke. Yeah, when I first heard about it, but no, it's quite prevalent. I mean, the largest racist group in the United States would have to be the Nation of Islam, which has hundreds of thousands of men signed up. I mean, they run an accredited university, Muhammad U. They have an armed force, the Fruit of Islam. So, I mean, I thought it'd be interesting to perhaps even go underground and look at that movement. Although I think by this point people might recognize me. I'm pretty light skinned and I'm mildly famous. So I don't know if they'd buy that I was a black Muslim or whatever. But those are two book ideas. I've also been approached recently about writing a science fiction novel.
Wow, I didn't expect to hear this.
Well, I actually drew up a couple of sci-fi prompts a few years back. One of them was written almost as a joking response to all these movies where the humans are the bad guys, like Avatar, Jurassic World, Planet of the Apes. I commented on social media once, fairly famously, that if I were the human general in Avatar, there'd be nothing left on the planet but burnt stumps and now V body parts. And I went to this whole discussion about how people were cheering against mankind, and it was just odd. But as a result of that, I
Yeah,
ended
but
up writing out
because it's not. Sorry to interrupt you. It's not mankind. It's the white capitalist people.
yes, yeah, whatever the
And
yes,
and and, and the true mankind are the Navi. Was this the name? They're
yeah. Now
the indigenous people. So
yeah, and I mean, it's a sort of a hilarious metaphor. I mean, the Na'vi are 9 foot tall, fang-toothed blue cannibals. I mean, so like if you're trying to say, well, if you actually read the backstory of the book and the movie, so if you're trying to say, well, these are the real people and the humans with their air conditioning and women's rights are the invasive savages. I mean, you're revealing a bit about yourself. But so the book I sketched out, 23, that's the number of human genetic chromosomes, is about a war between humans and aliens that's written in sort of a traditional fashion where the humans just wipe out the aliens. And I think there's some dry humor to it. But it actually asks some questions like how would we react if we did encounter another sapient carnivore species? And I mean, there'd be basically three reactions: annihilation, distance, or peaceful trade. So this book ends up in annihilation, but I'm also, and I think it'd be interesting to choose among them if we actually ran into aliens,
it's
which we
funny
may or
that
may
you
not.
mentioned science fiction. I've thought many times that science fiction gives opportunities that no other genre gives. And
Yes.
in particular, I'm thinking of one author, Stanislav Lem, if you have heard of him. He is not popular in the West. Stanislav Lem, he
Really?
was
No.
a Polish science fiction author who began to experiment with science fiction. He started as a traditional science fiction author in the 60s, in the 50s, 60s. But then he moved on and he was using the science fiction just as an opportunity to come with new weird forms of philosophizing. For example, he wrote reviews of non-existing books, reviewing books that supposedly exist. Or he came with his famous parodies of science fiction books, the Adventures of Yon Tiki, which
Okay.
were a bit like Baron Munchausen, but actually very philosophical, deeply philosophical, like Baron Munchausen actually is. It has these deeper layers, and it turns out science fiction is the best way to express something that is hard to express, something that doesn't fit a non-fiction book, that doesn't fit a traditional publication in a science magazine. You could do anything with science fiction because it's science fiction.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I mean, the same thing's true of fantasy. Like, if you look at good, well-written fantasy, I mean, there actually are questions. Like, I mean, Harry Turtledove or S.M. Sterling or something like that. I mean, you have to look at how would magic actually be treated if it existed, for example. I mean, would technology develop in a world where these human abilities um, were controlled by people? And what had happened to the people that had these abilities? I mean, in Robert Jordan's world, they're basically, unless they're powerful enough to be what's called asceti, they're basically tortured and hunted down and killed. Humans detest them, so they pursue them whenever they can. But I mean, past a certain point, they tend to become the leaders of regions, if not whole countries, and so on. So one of the science fiction writers that I just mentioned, actually, S.M. Sterling, has a whole series of books where he basically looks at human societies with different foundational principles from the ones that are common today. So, I mean, one of the societies, the Draca, is a group of out and out conquerors who based their national philosophy on very intelligent people, but Machiavelli, Subbotai, Nietzsche, and so on, as opposed to the kinder inspirers we've adopted in the modern West. And the book is actually fascinating. The characters aren't evil in any, real sense. They're just human beings that are following the rules of their society. Many of them are quite honorable, but they do things that, I mean, they didn't bother me all that much, but the average Westerner would probably be absolutely horrified by. And in one of the books, they actually fight what's intended to be our society, called the Republic of Samothrace, and beat it. There's some advantages on both sides, but it's a very Athens versus Sparta kind of situation, and the Draca, the bad guys, win. And it's reading through the books, you realize that, I mean, of course, there's some things that most societies view as wicked and whatnot, but that the social rules that exist within any particular society come out of a whole background complex of historical accidents and religious traditions and so on. And this culture, a sort of more brutal version of Rome, is at least as likely to emerge from human development as our own. So yeah, you can't do that in reality, obviously, because there no such country exists. There's another series, the last one, but a Shang Hio, I believe is the pronunciation, where the Chinese take over the world. So all of the Westerners in 200 years are essentially, members of vassal states within this Chinese empire. I forget how they did it, some kind of technological trick or something. But it is interesting watching the interplay of Chinese culture as the world's dominant culture. So everyone speaks Chinese instead of English and so on, different Chinese dialects, and the art that results from that, and so on down the line. And again, obviously, something that couldn't happen in reality. And not
Well,
much more to say there, really. I mean, good job, S.M. Sterling, and whoever.
all I can say is that this conversation was a lot more interesting than I imagined it would be.
Good, good.
Thank you very much, and I hope that we could talk again someday.
Of course, yeah.
What you say is fascinating. I mean, there are so many things right now going through my head.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed talking to you as well. And I do try to be a genuine intellectual as well as, enjoyable banterer online and so on. So, I mean, I have, in fact, I've written out the prompt for this book. I agree with you about science fiction. I agree with you about socialism. And I think that the question of how long a big lie can endure is something that we're gonna see because many of the things people have to believe right now, the United States, for example, is a systemically racist country when the wealthiest groups are Dravidian and black. I mean, like, how long can that go on? Well, we'll see. I mean, it's a really interesting question.
Thank you very much for participating for the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you.